Hello and welcome to Darker Days number 25. On this episode, we interview Sam Chupp, one of the original writers of the World of Darkness. Sam was an outstanding guest, and he was on the ball. He remembered everything, every kind of question we asked him, and even ones he might not have been prepared for. So, outstanding guest, and we really got to thank him because we said this interview was only to take about 50 minutes or so, and we ended up talking for 90 minutes total. So it's pretty extensive overview of the work he's done and work he's doing now, and we'd really like to thank him. We're going to save the White Wolf news and Secret Frequency for next episode, and we're just going to jump into this excellent interview. So let's listen to a quick promo from the Knights of the Night podcast, and then go on to the interview.
Knights of the Night podcast at kotonpodcast.com.
This is chapter 17.
What?
Did I say 17?
Yeah.
I am on drop. Take 2.
And the greed lights up in Michael's eyes.
You are an artifact 4. Well, don't say it like that.
I paid for that coin with blood.
A drop of blood.
Didn't see you pushing to the front of the line, my friend.
No means no, woman.
One of my flaws is that I'm a beacon for spiritual energy.
Whoa.
What?
Sorry.
What?
Nothing's beyond my medical skill.
What?
I don't have to rely on QB Doll's butter knives.
Said the guy who injects drugs into his eyeballs.
What? What?
Needle in the eye, baby.
What?
Edited for cleverness.
What?
kotonpodcast.com. Come join the fun.
Good evening, everyone. This is Mike here. I'm joined by Mark, and also an author steeped in mystery. The man, the myth, the urban legend, Sam Chupp. How are you, Sam?
Hey there. Wow, that's an incredible introduction. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
If I could just share something, I stumbled onto a special thanks in the A World of Darkness sourcebook from 1992. Mm-hmm. And it says, special thanks to Sam Chupp, Triple Agent, for being the only corporate spy in the gaming industry. Sorry for breaking your cover. So that was just a random goofy aside that I found, and just felt I could share that real quick.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like, I'll tell you a little bit about how all those special things are created.
Sure.
Basically, what happens is at the end of a book, when you are completely tired of the 64, 98, 128, 240, 360 pages that you just laid out and messed with, that you just edited, you developed, however you messed around with the book, you get to a point where you kind of go crazy a little. So, usually what happened with those special things is that somebody would be laying out the book and be in the final stages just before we go to print, and somebody will say, "Oh my God, we didn't do special things. We got to do it right now." And so people would walk around and, guys, do you have any special thanks for the Bone Gnawers Tribe book or whatever? So when we did that, people would just come up with little end jokes, little asides, little small things that would essentially make sense to the people on the staff at that time, and be completely, you couldn't possibly even understand it from the outside. But that's just one of the little things that we did, is just really self-serving, to be honest. It was just like, this is our little, our little mark on the book that is just for us. And so, but there were a lot of people who tried to guess what they meant, and there were some threads, there were some in-jokes and some puns and some, little things. Like one of them, one of the early ones I was in referred to the time I went out with the White Wolf crew on a Halloween club run, and I dressed up as Dr. Evil, the crime doctor. And we were all into pulp style way back then anyway. This was before any kind of pulp style games came out. And so I was Dr. Evil, and somebody else was the Mask of Midnight, and so on and so forth. But we had a great time doing that, and one of the special things talks about that. So yeah.
Cool. I think it's fun that it's the last thing that you do on the book, but as readers, it's the first thing that we come to when we open the cover.
Absolutely.
But it's always fun to kind of try and puzzle out what those are about, and without
every so
hope and
often,
hell.
every so often we'd have a game designer or a writer sort of like send us their special things to put in, and it was kind of like, yeah, if they're funny, we'll do it, but it was really just more for the people who are working on who are actually putting together the book. So the editors, the developers, the layout people, the art people, they got to sort of put their words in.
A little stamp on it at the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Well, as people have probably figured out, Sam was one of the original guys at White Wolf. Sam, you came on board as a layout person, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, what I did is I responded to a Usenet ad that Mark put out on Usenet saying, "Hey, we're looking for a layout artist." I had been doing layout for quite so many years at that point in time.
For those who don't know, by Mark, you mean, of course, Mark Reinhagen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
Exactly.
Rein.Hagen, yes.
Right,
yes.
yeah.
Yes. That's Mark, yeah. Mark is actually in former Soviet Georgia now.
Tbilisi or something, yeah.
Yeah. But at any rate, so he called, and I called him, and he said, "Well, why don't you come up for a weekend, and let's do an audition?" And I said, "Okay." And the audition was, lay out this book we have to have to the printer, next week.
Oh my God.
Nice.
So I sat down and I laid out Blood Bond, which was a little 8-page, 16-page, almost a module for Vampire that was to be added to sales of Vampire the Masquerade 2nd edition. I mean, I'm sorry, the first edition was the second or third printing of the first edition. So yeah, I got on pretty early, not as early as Lisa Stevens and Jonathan Tweet, who was in there in the beginning, and Stuart Wick, who was in there from the beginning. But I was not far after that.
So at this point, it's a real small company still. I take it.
We were living in a house. We were all working in a house. A suburban house, and the truck for the books would come and pull up, a big semi-truck. And then we would all go out. We'd drop whatever we were doing, and we'd go out and make a bucket brigade style loading of the crates from the back of the truck, all the way up into the garage of that particular house. And that was Wes Harris's garage. That was his entire warehouse for a period. So usually, though, we did drop ships from the printer directly to the distributors, and that's why we were able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Have that small house. But we moved from house to a office warehouse complex around the same time we started working on Werewolf.
Okay, right.
So,
and you were with White Wolf for how long in the end?
I was with them for 3 years, I think. Yeah, about 3 years.
Okay, and then did you continue to freelance after that?
I did. I worked with them off and on freelance for a while. I have not worked with them post CCP, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I wouldn't. I mean, I would be more than happy to work with them. It's just they got their irons in their fire in a big way.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep.
All right, Sam, just to take a step back, rewind a bit. How did you originally get started with gaming and on all that?
I went over to a guy's house when I was 8, and he said, "I'm going to run advanced Dungeons and Dragons for you." And I wanted desperately to be a wizard character, like my favorite character from the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf, at that time. And, of course, I tried to, do something the rules didn't really cover in the game by throwing a dagger, and he didn't really understand the rules enough to tell me how I threw daggers, and he kind of just really didn't understand the game very much, and he just got bored because everything bogged down in a combat scene. And so he said, "Look, I'm tired of doing this. We can do something else." And I said, "Well, what if I ran the game?" And he said, oh, well, how could you do that? You've never played before. This is your first day. I'm like, I can come up with something. So I did. And I ran I ran the first game I ever played by just totally creating it up out of the blue, just completely out of the blue, pulling it out of thin air. And so after that, I was hooked.
Excellent. Yeah, well, free form from the word go. That's outstanding.
Absolutely.
Great.
And had you any experience of Vampire the Masquerade before you joined White Wolf, or was it too early on for you to have been exposed to it yet?
No, I did actually. What was going on with that is that I was a huge Lion Rampant fan. Lion Rampant was before White Wolf, and I loved Ars Magica.
Yeah.
The second, I was able to pick up second edition Ars Magica, and I was able to pick up some of their supplements, and they had various story path decks that I got, and and then I was at the gaming store, and they were like, got this new game, Vampire the Masquerade, and I said, okay, I'll buy that and see what it's like. And so I actually tried to play it with my D&D group, and it ended up being kind of D&D with fangs, but I really appreciated like the story aspects, the encouragement towards telling stories that was part of the game. And I tried to get my players at that time to really get into the whole embrace, and I ran preludes for each of them and so on and so forth, and it was a lot of fun. But that was about it before I actually went to White Wolf. Then after I went to White Wolf, nobody wanted to play. Because when you do it all day long and you work your butt off trying to get these books out the door, the last thing you really want to do is sit down and mess with them some more. So I thought that I'd be going to this gaming company and I'd be working and gaming 24/7, but it was just, that wasn't how it was.
All of a sudden, it's a job.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I still love gaming anyway, and I was able to later on find a group of people to play Werewolf with, and a group of people to play. We had this awesome werewolf vampire crossover game that was going on where I was storyteller for the werewolves and somebody else was storyteller for the vampires, and then it was set in the same milieu, so we traded storylines and characters back and forth across the two games.
Oh, brilliant!
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I also very much enjoyed the playtesting we did. And, of course, Werewolf version 1, the playtest, was essentially vampires with fur.
Okay, right.
It was just Vampire the Masquerade with fur. There were disciplines and, it was just the same. It was more of the same.
How structured were the playtests? I mean, do you have... like, tonight we're going to run through combats. Tonight we're going to try some social interactions, or is it just let's belly up to the table and play and see what comes out of it?
Well, the very first playtests were not really playtests. They would be what we would call in the indie gaming circles play storming more than play testing, because what it was essentially a lot of flavor and atmosphere and a character sheet to look at and a story in mind, but it was very free-formy and very sort of open-ended. Those were the very first playtests, so that essentially the designer could get an idea of where they were heading. And then later on, one of the things Mark likes to talk about in all of his design discussions is something he called creative destruction, where you build up something, you look at it, you evaluate it, you run it a few times, and then you destroy it completely. And then we just sort of say, okay, forget all that and start over. And then we build it up a little bit more. And then sometimes we do another like complete new rebuild. And that's just the way that Mark liked to design. And sometimes I believe it did result in better play, and sometimes I think it resulted in a little bit more confusion. But and that's why there was a need for heavy development, heavy editing, and cleanup later on.
Right, so you have like a series of progressive like waves of design almost
Yes.
washing over each other, and
Exactly.
does that result in artifacts from earlier iterations of the game being left behind, kind of embedded in the more
Yes.
developed material?
Yes, everyone has become familiar with Page XX,
Right.
and that's where all those elements go.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, okay, yeah. Basically, that's very astute that you would pick up on that because that's exactly what happens. And a lot of the criticism people leveled against version 2, The World of Darkness, has been, well, it just doesn't hang together. All the scales are different. It's not all one game.
Yeah.
And the reason they came out with the next version of the World of Darkness is because they wanted to go through and do what I call GURPSify it. That is to say, make it a generic, universal World of Darkness role-playing game.
Right.
And then plug everything into that. And that's fine for people who like consistency. I'm not really a big fan of consistency myself, but I can understand that there are people out there who want to know, God damn it, like how powerful their werewolf is. How strong it is compared to, a third generation vampire, and who would win in a fight or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. That's great. That wasn't me. That wasn't what I like to do, and certainly not what any of the designers I knew enjoyed. So it's just to each their own, and I think that the new World of Darkness, as it were, came out and it really did appeal to all those folks who were looking for that kind of consistency.
There certainly is a degree of, like you said, it's similar to GURPS, I suppose, where you can look at one book and you can look at another and you can compare, and they are designed to be played within the same world from the outset.
Yep.
Whereas, the earlier Old World of Darkness, it kind of lumbered along in that direction, but but like you say, it was not unified at all. For me, that's part of its charm, I think.
Yeah, I think as time went on, there were sort of two camps of editing and design that sort of started to show themselves as the different games released over time. You have what I call like the subjective people like Mark Reinhagen and Andrew Greenberg, who were at that time thinking in terms of this, Vampire is a game by itself.
Yeah.
Werewolf is a game by itself. And when you play Werewolf, you're playing Werewolf. And if you want vampires in the game, then you have to introduce those characters as in the context of Werewolf, not as some sort of generic universal vampire.
Right.
But as you go into the developers starting with Phil Brucato, going to Jennifer Hartshorn and Ian Lemke, you start looking at, and Bill Bridges a little bit, not as much. You start seeing where they diverge, and that whole, well, gosh, we have to make these things fit together. We have to figure out, who Elvis is, because, or who Rasputin is.
I was just going to say, which clan does Rasputin belong to?
Yeah. Rasputin was a big deal. Like, who the hell is Rasputin? Like, is he a Nosferatu? Is he a Sabbat? Who was he? And people who need answers to those questions started to become people who were in charge of creating the game. So then they would say, well, Elvis was a Bonar, kinfolk. Boom. There you go. And forever it shall be. But ultimately, that and that's why you saw the third edition come out, because those developers and their viewpoints just sort of built on each other. But the confusion came in the transition, because you had games that were developed from a subjective standpoint coming into and trying to be folded into an objective standpoint.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the difference in developers, the effect that it has on the game. And for me, there's almost not a cutoff, but a fairly strong transition between the first three, Vampire, Werewolf, and Mage, and the last two of the big ones, Wraith and Changeling. And the way the benchmark I've always looked at it with is, what's the difference between the first and second edition of those games like? And the difference between Vampire first and second is, moderate to strong. Between Werewolf first and second is quite strong. Between Mage first and second is really strong, I think. They're almost different game lines. But between Wraith and first and second and Changeling first and second, there's not that much difference in tone and play. And it's almost the impression that I got by that time. A lot of these, subjective, non-subjective kinks have been kind of ironed out. That's just the kind of impression that I had by the time you get that far into the company's life.
Right. Well, you look at creators like Jennifer Hartshorn and Ian Lemke. Jennifer was, she's a classically trained editor. She has, Shakespearean background. She has literature, English literature background. She also has, she also came from, one of her big pastimes in undergraduate school was playing on World of Darkness mushes. So she's like a third or second generation role player who'd already been playing and had been sitting there cutting her teeth on the inconsistencies.
Right.
If I play a Malkavian anti-tribu, can I teach dementation to my ghoul? She would actually be dealing with those questions on a daily basis as a judge of a couple of different games. She was on City of Darkness mush for a while, and she was on a bunch of different ones. That's where I got to know her. And in fact, that's one of the ways she got recruited. I mean, she would have gotten recruited separately anyway, but I also got to know her that way. And so when she came in to take over the developing of Wraith, she was a known quantity at that point. But she'd been playing these games for a while. So the people who dealt with and wanted consistency over the course of time and wanted more of an objective viewpoint, they started to come in, and that's why you didn't see... They were actually more conservative with the games. You didn't see a big change between first and second edition.
Yeah.
Whereas people like Phil Brucato took the basic game of Mage that was given to him, and he had to make it work. And so, that's why Mage Second Edition is really the only... I mean, to a certain extent, as any other game may be playable, I think Mage Second Edition is the only real playable version of Mage. Mage First Edition, you had to just kind of do a lot of hand-waving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one that hooked me, but I totally hear what you're saying.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I also want to point out that up until the Mage game itself, no one had ever done a metaphysic of the World of Darkness, and no one had ever tried to pull back far enough to get an objective viewpoint on the entire game world universe.
Right.
Vampire is a personal tale. Werewolf is a tribal tale. And so Mage is the first universal tale. It's the first, how do we encompass all this stuff? And then you suddenly realize that the werewolves were just one tiny part of a whole. That's why, I think, another reason why people started to really demand to have that kind of consistency.
Yeah, when it becomes possible for them to exist within a unified world, I suppose people are going to want that. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Well, actually, speaking of consistency and all that, I definitely want to ask you, Sam, some questions about the Book of Nod, because I have to say it's a major turning point in Vampire the Masquerade as a setting, and it's a book that I'm reading this now in 2010, 2011, and it holds up very well within the meta plot of Vampire the Masquerade. And I'm also reading this for a class right now, Apocalypticism in Film, where I'm going to be discussing the apocalyptic elements of Vampire the Masquerade for my final paper. And I've got to say, from a scholarly standpoint, you nailed it, Sam. You actually did a very good job with this with the biblical writings in it.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad you say that. It was something of a goal of mine, but some very brief background on that. Mark Ryan Hagen's father was a Lutheran minister. And when Mark began to put together Vampire, he knew he wanted to put some Judeo-Christian elements into the game. thus the story of Cain and Abel. The Book of Nod was a bit of flavor text in the book in the front of Vampire the Masquerade First Edition. There was like a couple of paragraphs there. And that was what I was handed as, okay, this is kind of what you need to do. Just take this and make a book out of it. And so it was like a couple of paragraphs, and it sort of retold the Cain and Abel story a little bit. And so I took that element, and that's kind of where that whole Luther minister influence, Mark Reinhagen's acceptance of the spiritual, of the importance of the Judeo-Christian mythos in modern popular culture, because you realize that until that point, the whole, there was some Eastern Christianity in Tales of Vlad Tepes and stuff like that, but the Western Christian tradition was not put into the vampire myth as firmly as that. I mean, yeah, we had crosses that were presented and made vampires flinch, but that is, I mean, I might point at that moment as being like a turning point for the addition of the Judeo-Christian Western tradition into vampire lore. I could be wrong. I'm totally willing to be called out on that. At any rate, so Mark gave this to me and said, I want you to, add that to the, put this in context in the Book of Nod. So I had to come up with a reason why my stuff would be slightly different. And I came up with the backstory of this bloodline of vampires who were able to travel, in the daylight without being burned up, and who were able to move around and use various psychometry sort of powers to read areas and get references from time and that sort of thing. And so the backstory of this person who is putting together all of the body of lore that could be found about the Book of Nod, and that was going to be the whole book. It was conceived first and foremost as an art book and as a prop for a game. I mean, and that's really what makes it a lot of fun, because you can hand your players this book and say, okay, so this is what you see. But from a standpoint of, I didn't want it to just be a cheesy prop. I wanted it to be something that had some, what Joseph Campbell calls mythic resonance. So I had to sort of dip a little deeper than just, let's go and read what the Hebrew Bible says. Which I did do that. I went back and I tried to look at translations of Aramaic, translations of the Hebrew Bible, and I was able to look at things like Hebrew Midrash, and other things like that. And I was pointed that direction by my now ex-wife, Leanne Hildebrand. She was into women's spirituality in a big way, and she was a women's studies major in college, and she was exposing me to a lot of these things. And so there were all these books around with these kind of things in them, and I started reading them. And I read about the Midrash of Lilith, which is Adam's first wife, and who wanted to be on top, and who Adam going to God like a tailor and saying, God, this woman person thing that you got me, it's not quite what I wanted. Can you make it a little better or different, and things like that. I mean, those kind of stories, the Jewish folk tales, essentially Midrash. I wanted to put that in there because we'd already opened the door to Judeo-Christian, so it was no problem to put that in there. But I also wanted to think about really, really ancient times, and through the books that were lying around my house at that time, I found Inanna, and the Sumerian mythos and the translations of the hymns to Inanna, and that cadence of she called for this, she called for this, she called for that. She went forward, and then, you know, she was the blossoming of the night blooming flower. She was the golden sheaf. She was, you know, and all this repetitive, you know, slightly repetitive cadence of the Sumerian hymns to Nana and other things like that. And I really just read all that stuff, and then I let it steep in the back of my head. And I spent a lot of time, because while I was writing the Book of Nod, I was also working all day, and I was taking care of an infant daughter, and I was, you know, basically a very busy person. So I would stay up till very, very late at night, and I would enter these weird states of, you know, like, I don't even know. I would look up from time to time and go, did I write that? You know, I can't remember even typing that.
Trance states almost.
Yeah. And then so I put it all together, and I tried to put in the notes for all those things. I wrote all of the words first, all of the verses first. And then I went back through and I tried to annotate using, you know, things that would give people jumping off points to create stories out of. And I would make references to things like, you know, the Arine's fragments, or, you know, and of course we've seen this in other places repeated time and time again, but of course I discovered that was a false. But I'm now starting to wonder whether, you know, I just go on and on and on, building in story seeds so that later on people could come back and, you know, make it their own.
Yeah.
And that's how I did it. I mean, it was fairly simple after that, putting it all together and then handing it over to a brilliant developer, Andrew Greenberg, who, you know, saw the need for kind of a punk kind of aspect to the book, and so he put the like, there's a end papers part where the one of the scions of Delarant, the person who wrote the book, it responds to him and talks about various things he said, and I thought that was great. And then Michelle Praler took the book and made it awesome, made it beautiful. There are some people who say, well, gosh, that page, the Malkavian text, I could never read it. Well, you know, Michelle made that choice to put black text on black text effectively because she thought it was first of all, I think she thought it was just a very, very strange verse, and it was meant to be kind of bizarre. And she just wanted to make it even stranger by making it very difficult to read.
The artistic element is very strong in the book. It's, you know, really kind of leaps out at you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually reading that page on the bus yesterday, and I was specifically thinking, like, oh, I think they did this on purpose.
Yep. It was definitely done on purpose.
Very cool. So, a full, like, quarter of the book is discussing Gehenna, like the apocalypse, and you did quite a bit of work with that, and you really developed it. Because when we look at Vampire the Masquerade First Edition, there's only maybe a paragraph or two discussing Gehenna, and that's it. It's very, very minor element. Right. So I guess, first off, what kind of religious texts did you look at for inspiration, or did you kind of go in there a little blind?
Well, like I said, I did look. I mean, I have been, before that, prior to even coming to White Wolf for a while, I went to a private Christian school for a period, and it was a very fundamentalist school, and they taught a lot of the old King James Version, Southern Baptist style Bible thumping, hellfire and brimstone.
Kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. Now, that stuff is extremely powerful because it plugs into a lot of stuff in our subconscious that we don't really recognize until later. And it's a very, you know, the Revelations, the book of Revelation, the Bible, is incredibly, it sounds very frightening. I mean, just the very nature of that is just so bizarre and weird, and it's supposed to send, the way that it's been, sort of massaged over the years, it's supposed to send chills down your spine, and it does. It's funny that it comes from a political tract written by John, a criticism of government practices, but hey, I'm a big fan of taking one thing that's used for one thing and then repurposing it to another, and that's what a lot of people have done. I don't necessarily agree with that particular practice, but the idea of taking a model and using it for something else is kind of fun, and that's what I did with Gehenna. Is I took my memories of all the preaching I heard about the Book of Revelation, including all the stuff that isn't in the Bible, like talking about the tribulations and talking about all the end time stuff that was made popular by various. There's a lot of Christian fantasy, Christian adventure books that came out about that period of time. The Rapture, and I mean, stuff that is just amazing, and it all comes completely out of. I mean, it's not in the Bible, so where it came from, I don't know for sure. I think it would require some cultural detective work to really find out where all that stuff came from. But it's like there's a couple of verses here and there, and then people take it and run with it. Yeah. So I was steeped in that culture, and then I got better, and then I went on to college, and I was an English major, and I took Philosophy 101, and my brain broke open, and I was able to then just see the patterns of things, and so when it was time to write the Book of Nod, I wanted to draw upon that sense of foreboding, that sense of these are the end times. I wanted to, but you have to think about, like, what is going to really scare a vampire? Yeah. The time of thin blood is one of those things that it's like a plague. It's like one of the plagues during Passover. I mean, it's just like, oh my goodness, what if we couldn't, what if at some point we're just not going to be able to feed ourselves anymore? Yeah. And it strikes at the heart of that sort of primal need. Then there's also some things where I was able to do some story seed planning, talking about the woman with the birthmark. The mark, yes. All these different things, which, I could just pull out of thin air and put in there and have it mean anything or nothing at all.
Well, it's interesting because it casts such a long shadow over the game line. For a small supplement that came out very early in the game's life, these things ultimately came. I mean, the vampire apocalypse is at the end of the Book of Nod. Ultimately came to determine the course of the game's metaplot in its entirety. 10, 12, 13 years on.
Right, and I think that's really due to the that tendency I was talking about earlier, where the developers started to really want to have consistency, and so when they started to think about the end of the world, I mean, I wasn't part of those discussions or those ideas when they started to think about the end of the game line, but they certainly must have pulled out the Book of Nod and said, all right, so what are we going to do to vampires? And just, okay, so there's all this stuff that Sam wrote in the Book of Nod. Where are we going to put these things? And,
sure. You look at the Gehenna book itself. You can absolutely see those thumbprints all over it. The last daughter of Eve, the girl with the mark, etc., etc. They're all right in there as adventures.
Right. Cool. And that's great. And also, I might point out that those things were also used before the whole end times thing started by storytellers who wanted to scare the crap out of people. Yeah. Is this the last times? That whole big question mark. So, yeah.
Indeed. Cool.
It's actually really interesting that you're bringing up how you wanted to make something to scare vampires. And when you look at the apocalypse for early Christians, they couldn't wait for it to happen They're gonna get to heaven. It was all gonna be great. It was gonna be a great time. But when you look at modern media, you're gonna have a lot of these apocalypses which are supposed to scare people. It's these people who are relatively unoppressed having to face a new world order which they fear and want to fight.
Cataclysms and destruction.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very interesting that it kind of mirrors some of the way that the media portrays the apocalypse nowadays. And one thing you always find in the apocalypse with regard to Christianity is that kind of Messiah figure. And you do have this in the Book of Nod in a couple of different ways. And I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit. You've got the last daughter of Eve, and it specifically states that within her, the fate of all will be decided. And that's interesting for a mortal Messiah in some ways. And it's also kind of nice that it's a female in this case, and not the usual male that you find in Judeo-Christianity.
Right.
The other person I wanted to talk about a little bit is Salat, the clan founder of Clan Salubri. And he is cast in a very positive light in this book, but as other people took the character through the course of Vampire Masquerade, he became more devilish at times. He's got that link to the Baali that he might have created them, the demonic vampire bloodline. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on that character. Did you really see him as being a vampire messiah, or am I kind of going in the wrong direction?
Well, keeping in mind that the Book of Nod is really designed to be sort of a dark mirror that you hold up to your game and say, what do I take from this? Where do I put this? That is always the first motivation in the text. You can always ascribe most of the decisions I made in the writing to that. Now, having said that, there are certainly mythic resonances there of a messiah. And you did pick up on the fact that in this game, in this particular book, the Book of Nod, I put Lilith in there, another female, and I wanted to highlight the last daughter of Eve because there was a need to have some feminine energy balancing all the masculine in my mind, because vampires they have a very powerful feminine mystique, even if they are male, and so I wanted to say, like, okay, this is where this comes from. But to more fully answer your question, there's another level to this, and it's a game design level. Andrew Greenberg, the developer of Vampire at the time, I think there was a serious back and forth between himself and the designer the writer who wrote the Salubri. Now, Salubri came out in the Player's Handbook, which, the Player's Guide, which was the first big successful supplement to Vampire. And if you recall, it gives you all these different disciplines, and it gave you all these new bloodlines, and the Ravnos were in there, and and the Salubri were in there, and really ultimately the Salubri were designed to be those, healing kind of characters. But Andrew would not allow that to happen. There was a lot of debate about that for the longest time. And what finally ended up happening, and to be truthful, I do not remember who originally designed or created the idea of the Salubri. I might say that was a Steve Brown thing, but I don't know for sure. And maybe somebody else will speak up and say, oh, no, I know who it was. But I do recall Andrew saying, no, that's not going to happen. Salubri is, that's actually evil. And it's kind of like painting them as the idea of Lucifer being the angel of the dawn, being the bright angel of morning. Lucifer being the most beautiful of all of God's angels, and that whole concept of beauty and purity and goodness just doesn't exist for vampires. Andrew was very much a fan of that idea, that there is no such thing as love for vampires, that they could never feel love as far as he was concerned, and that they could never be good. And so that's why you see a lot of the references to the Bali and this whole secret subplot of the Salubri are really evil.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I can see the benefits of both sides of it. You know, there's a certain gothic romanticism in having the doomed love of the undead,
Mm-hmm.
but on the flip side, yeah, I can also see the benefit of these creatures are ultimately monsters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and love is really about not being selfish, but a vampire is one of the most selfish creatures in the universe, as far as, you know, the way that they're portrayed.
Yeah.
So,
Great. Well, you pretty much just covered every single question I had on the Book of Nod, so outstanding job.
thank you.
Very cool, very cool. Mark, do you have any more questions on the Book of Nod, or should we move on to some other books?
Just one question. I wondered if you'd, and the Book of Nod was, you know, it really did set a precedent. There's any number of those little kind of game supplements. I dug all mine out today, actually. There's, you know, a good 8 or 9 of the things.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically, I was wondering about, did you ever have much input into, or did you get a chance to look at specifically Revelations of the Dark Mother or the Ersius Fragments? I think the Ersius Fragments was like the medieval version of the Book of Nod, and Revelation of the Dark Mother was the Lilith-centric version of the same.
Mm-hmm. The Fragments book was actually, I created the name for that because I just sort of threw that in there as an aside.
Right.
So I planted that seed, and later on it was brought out and used. As far as did I have anything to do with them? No, I didn't. But Phil Brucato told me that, you know, he really, you know, he studied the Book of Nod, and he really tried to sort of, you know, emulate the kind of process that I went through to do the same thing with that sort of Lilith-focused book. Plus, you know, another reason why those books are so plentiful is because they're cheap to produce, as far as from a capital standpoint, from like a business standpoint, very inexpensive to produce, and they were just tremendous sellers because anytime you have a book that can be purchased by both players and storytellers, it's an automatic win. You know, there's many more players than there are storytellers, and there's a lot of, and anytime you can also simultaneously appeal to the LARP crowd, forget it.
Yeah.
It's going to work. It's going to generate some sales. I'd love to see the sales numbers one day of, you know, I don't even know if they've even been kept over the course of time, but I'd love to see how Book of Nod did over the course of time, and also how these little books did. But you also notice the, I don't know if you're familiar with the indie game community at all, but they use almost the same form factor for a lot of their books.
Yeah. No, they are. They're about the same size. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That's true. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I had a number of other questions, but they also relate to your work on the various other Worlds of Darkness and White Wolf game lines. But Mike, I don't know if you were still wanted to carry on with your apocalyptic line of questions there, Mike, or were you pretty much done with that?
No, as I said, Sam, you covered pretty much everything. The last thing I want to bring up about the Book of Nod is it appeals to even more than just role players. I gave it to my girlfriend just to read, and she loved it. She just sat down, read through the entire thing in one sitting. So I think it really speaks to it.
I was able to perform, to actually like read it to a crowd before it came out at Aresia, which is a convention in Boston, and had a great time, you know, reading it for them. And like I said, I still occasionally just look at it and go, did I really write that? Because I don't remember some of the stuff that comes up. And I just sort of go, well, you know, and also you have to give Andrew Greenberg some credit too, because ultimately he went through everything, and he's that's what developers do. They take what the writers give them, and they put it in, and they go through everything line by line and make sure it all hangs together. So, you know, I am more than happy to take credit for it, the stuff that I did, and I also wanted to finish by saying that I've actually had people contact me privately and ask me who told me these secrets. They claim to be part of the Church of Nod, and they're serious. They actually are spiritual. They found some sort of spiritual connection with the words, or with the Book of Nod, or with vampires, and they've written me and said, who told you these secrets really? And I say, I'm sorry, I made it up. Yes, okay, I understand you have to say that.
Brilliant.
But really, did you really talk to an older vampire? I said, no, I really did not. I really created this whole cloth. I mean, I guess you might say, well, Sam, when you were passing out like that from exhaustion, you probably were in touch with some higher power, but I don't know. I don't think so.
Of course, you would say that, though, wouldn't you? You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's right.
Geez,
Great.
Sam, it sounds like you made another Church of Scientology here.
Yeah, well, maybe I do need to check that off my list. Things to do before I die.
Excellent. Well, in addition to work on Vampire the Masquerade, you've worked on, all the other main Old World of Darkness lines.
Mm-hmm.
Werewolf, you said you had your Werewolf, Great Werewolf crossover game. Did you? Werewolf it's called Werewolf the Apocalypse. Did you find that your work on the Book of Nod was particularly informative or helpful in getting into the apocalyptic mindset for the Werewolf game?
Yeah, what I did with that is I read a lot of the accounts of the first encounters with the Europeans made with Native Americans. I read a lot of Native American myth. I had a lot of friends who were into Native American myth, but I also had a grounding in spirituality and nature spirituality, and I had my own personal grounding in knowing people who were pagans and witches and druids and people in real life who believe this is their religion, and so this is their spiritual practice. So I was able to come at it from that perspective as well. And Mark did tell me at one point, he said, look, without you in this game, without you in the game design team, this game would not have been as spiritual as it was. Because it was just a game, a splatterpunk kind of, gore fest up until that point.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because I've always found, in the Werewolf games that I ran, sure, we enjoy ripping the heads off black spiral dancers and smashing factories and stuff, but the spiritual tribal element ultimately is the thing that makes the game endure, and that's what kept us coming back to it. So if that was down to your input, then hats off, because you really nailed that one too.
Yeah, like the Incarna, for example, the pack totems and such. There was just going to be a trait called pack totem before that.
Okay.
And I said, no, we need to bring out the pack totems. We need to make them. And we actually, it's funny how things get added to games because of a quirk of the printing industry. I don't know if you've ever heard of signatures as a concept in printing, but basically you have to come up with a number divisible by 16 or 8 for numbers of pages. And that's just because that's how things are printed. So frequently enough, what would happen is we get to the end of a layout on a book, and we would need, 5 more pages or, 3 more pages or whatever. And we couldn't cut anything. So that's what happened with Werewolf First Edition, actually. We got to the end of the book, and there were, I think, 5 or 6 pages that needed to be filled, and you're not going to put 5 or 6 pages of notes on the back. People would not like that at all. So I stayed up all night writing the pack totems that night, and I presented it to Mark as both a problem and a solution. Mark, problem, we need 5 more pages. Solution,
here they are.
Here's the stuff that I've written. And so was able to put that in at the last minute, and then Player's Handbook, the Player's Guide for Werewolf came out, and I got to put in the clave dueling stuff, and
yes, very
a lot of the really fun maneuvers and things that that added to the game and expanded it out a little bit.
Was the fetish system another one of those, or was that already
The what fetish system? Yeah, the fetish system definitely. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, cool.
That was another one of mine. Putting together fetishes and trying to, make a sense out of them.
Now you mentioned the Incarna. I saw on your website on the Book of the Worm that you wrote up the Mage Incarna.
I did. Yes.
So what was the inspiration for those wonderful people?
Well, just the shadow side of a lot of different things. Trying to take various concepts of corruption and make them more real. And that's really the long and short of it.
Okay, well, nice and simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also noticed that you mentioned that you created the Goral and the Ratkin.
I did.
Were you asked to create those specifically? So we need Werebears and Were-Rats, or did you just have free reign to devise any kind of shifter you wanted?
Well, yeah. Bill was putting together the book, the player's guide, and there was a lot of questions as to what would be put in as a shifter, and I really, really, really wanted there to be Werebears, and I had been playing Werewolf during that time, and my pack had gone to a realm where, like a far realm, in the Umbra, where there were a bunch of Ratkin people, and it was sort of a film noir kind of realm where the rats were actually gangsters and they wore bowler hats. I mean, the fedoras and trench coats, and they had Tommy guns, and it was a lot of fun.
Brilliant.
Rat gangsters, yes. And so it was a lot of fun. And so I thought, well, and also I had been writing the stuff for the Bonars. And so, and Bonars and rats are, heavily tied back together. Yeah. So I went ahead and wrote up the stuff for the Were-Rats, and I wrote up the stuff for the Were-Bears because I just love bears in general. And I wanted the bears to be kind of like the older brother of the werewolves, the kind of the older, wiser, but now, a little bit less powerful because they sort of sat things out a bit. And the greatest thing was that I got to play a Were-Bear once in a LARP. I walked into a game that was crazy. Werewolves chasing vampires through the halls, and it was just ridiculous. And I was able to become, like, the storytellers were like, we need your help. We need you to help us. Because the werewolves are going crazy. We don't know what to do, but we don't know how to fix them. We just introduced them to the game, and we thought they would be okay. But they're killing vampires left and right. I'm like, okay. So I said, can I have any character I want? And they said, yes. And I said, okay, I'm going to play an Elder Goral. And they said, what? And what we did is I took them out to the beach. It was a con at a beach. Yeah, I had such a terrible life. And there's this wonderful beach, white sand beach, and this beautiful full moon over the whole convention.
Oh, perfect.
And I gathered all the werewolves together, and I showed them, I did the whole dominance thing with every single one of them, showing them, no, I really am a Goral elder, and I can put you down. And once I did that, I got all the werewolves together. We did a rite of Karen creation in the middle of the game, and we created a Karen on the beach. And there was this guy who was so into it that he was digging a hole, and he made all these. He went up and down the beach with driftwood and shells, and made this complicated design, a magic circle, and oh man, it was wonderful. And
That's
of
really
course,
fantastic.
The vampires were much happier when they were not having to dodge crazy
Angry
werewolves trying
Guru.
to kill them.
Yeah.
Yes. They could get on to the business of sticking knives in each other's backs.
Yeah, good solid vampire stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
I also note that you wrote the Death Takes Last story as well.
Death Takes Last, yes.
Yeah, that was fantastic. That character, I was so inspired by that. Used him as a long-running NPC in one of my games.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Very cool. And also the renown system. That you sorted out the second edition version of that, I understand.
That's right.
Which is a huge improvement over the one in the first edition book.
And I got to influence the stuff with Werewolf, with the Apocalypse LARP as well, through that renown system. So that was a lot of fun too, and it worked really well once it was introduced to the Werewolf game that I was part of.
Cool. Now, before we came on air, you mentioned that you didn't, in fact, write the rap on the back cover of the Bone Gnawers book.
No, I didn't.
We'll just gloss over that and move swiftly along.
I mean, okay, it could be said that I wrote the first draft of it, but I sort of started out in a general zone, and then Andrew Greenberg stopped me, and he said, "No, it's got to scan, and it's not scanning." And I said, "Okay," and he said, "I'm taking this away from you now." And Andrew and Josh Timbrook and a couple of other people in the office got together, and they've actually made it scan and made it work. So to a certain extent, it's still awful, but I'll just go ahead and take responsibility for it because I wanted to have a wrap. I mean, it was my idea to have a wrap on the back cover.
Right. Okay. Cool. Well, it's settled.
Yep.
Now, before I completely geek out about Mage, I thought it was important to talk about Wraith for a little bit, because you did a lot of work on the early stuff on Wraith. Well, the core book itself, which I still think it's a groundbreaking release. Not just in White Wolf's game line, but in gaming in general, simply because of the themes and the approach that it takes to playing a character in the shadow and what have you. But also, I noticed that you were working on Face of Death, the art, prose, poetry book, along with Mark Reinhagen.
Yes.
And what was your contribution on that one? Were you co-writing it together, or was it from a concept by him, or how did that pan out?
I'm trying to remember that. That was like one of the last things we did with Wraith. It was one of the last things I did for the company. But I think that it was originally thought of as, here's an art book, and it's going to be pretty, and we can sell this alongside of Wraith or before Wraith comes out, because it's a lot easier to put together an art book with the covers of all the books that you've already decided you're going to make as part of it. It's very much easier to do that and have something pretty to show people. Having said that, I think the parts about that book were the stuff that I wrote, which dovetails with my novel, Sins of the Fathers, which is a novel that I wrote on contract. Sins of the Father, yeah. And I think that was my contribution to that.
Okay. And what was Wraith like to work on as a game line in general? I ran a short Wraith Chronicle that was it was really, really miserable, to tell you the truth. I mean, we enjoyed it as gamers, but my God, it's a dark game. Did you find that a challenge as a designer when you were working on it, that you had to get in some pretty dark places there, or did it, were you able to distance yourself from that element of the work?
Oh yeah, working on Wraith was like mainlining Drano.
Wow.
It was awful. It was probably one of the worst experiences of my life, and in terms of just dredging up all of that, living it on a day-to-day basis. The whole idea behind Wraith came out of a game that Mark freeformed for some people at one point in time, where he wanted to do a story where you start out in hell, and your characters are all in hell, and you have to deal with your sins and going through all this. It was just very much of a psychodrama kind of thing. And that particular game, I think he called it Inferno, never got made because it was, he claimed later on that it was cursed. And that it would never be made. And yet, when he brought up the Inferno aspects of Wraith, that he wanted it to be extremely dark. He wanted it to be, dark, 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 with more dark and dark on top of dark. Yeah. He kind of set that in motion, and then he had to go I mean, he did a lot of work on initial work on Wraith, and then he had to do other things. The vampire TV show was coming out,
Right.
so that he went to Los Angeles to deal with that. He also had an extended tour in Brazil with all the Brazilian gamers down there. So it was kind of like, okay, Sam and Jennifer, cope with it. Deal here. Boom. We were sick all the time. We were depressed. We were staying up all night a lot. We were walking endlessly through graveyards. We were almost like living a Morrissey album. It was, it was terrible. And it didn't help that I was going through a divorce at that time, and it didn't help that, just there's all this awful stuff that happened. So it was a terrible time, and yet, I am proud of what we did. I think of Wraith as my deformed little half-born child that I still love because he's my child, and I love him anyway, and I will claim him and I will defend him from anyone. But I have never played more than one demo version of Wraith, like a one session of Wraith with anybody. And there are people who come up to me and say, "I love Wraith. It's my favorite game. I've played it now for 5 years, and I have to control myself to keep from taking a step back from them." Because I just want to play. Yeah, I've had people come up to me and say that and tell me that, and that they love it, and I am very happy that they get something out of it, and I'm very happy that it's still out there and still going for a lot of people. And I think that Richard Dansky did an incredible job with it after I left the company.
Yeah, we had him on the show a few months back, and it was very interesting.
He's an awesome fella, and I couldn't have been happier that he was made the developer after a while. So, and because he really gets horror, and that's what Wraith is. It's terror, it's horror. But having said that, if you look at the indie gaming circles these days, there are games like Don't Rest Your Head,
and
Dread, that are like, you might as well just sort of, you have to really turn the card over and say, yeah, look, Wraith is right there on the back. The thing of it is, and also, I've had people tell me, the designer of Polaris tell me that he took a lot of that from Wraith. So, and I'm really happy that the game went on and influenced a lot of people.
Well, people are still hugely passionate about it when you run into Wraith fans online, and a lot of people describe it as the best game that they can't play. And
absolutely, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned the Sins of the Father novel, and I saw that you were writing that around about the same time as working on Necropolis Atlanta.
Yes.
And did that overlap much? Or
yes, actually it did, yeah.
And you mentioned in Necropolis Atlanta you worked on the vampires that are at the back of the book.
I did. And those vampires actually, I created a secondary chronicle in the same realm as the one I talked to you about earlier, the Werewolf vampire game that I ran with another fellow. And I had 3 wonderful women come to play at my house every week for a short period of time, and they were my vampire graces. They were awesome, and I love gaming with women, period, in general, but they had so much fun with me, pushing me to be as, well, gosh, it was just such a lot of levels of intrigue in that game, and I created the Vampire Court of Atlanta out of that, for that particular game. So a lot of the stuff that you see in my books are taken directly from the games that I was running at the time.
Well, that's what I wondered when I was looking over them. I thought this feels very true to life, very from the table kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much so.
One last question on Wraith, the player's kit.
Mm-hmm.
Whose idea was the death certificate?
Oh,
I just
that's
love
Richard
that.
Thomas.
Is
Yeah,
it?
that's
Oh,
Richard
that's
Thomas.
great.
Yes,
Nice.
Richard Thomas. A lot of the things, a lot of the little touches in the books, you will find Richard Thomas is behind them. The werewolf tattoos, for example, the werewolf glyphs.
Oh, cool.
Those are all Richard Thomas. He actually strapped a bunch of Sharpies to his hand, and he would stand in front of like a pad of paper, and he would make little swooshes and swashes to see if you had giant claws, could you really draw these glyphs?
Oh, cool.
So yeah, I mean, he's just an awesome guy. He was an incredible art director, but he was also a great artist in and of himself.
Great. Well, when I gave those death certificates to my players, it really, really upset them. So, which is what you want, of course.
Oh, wow.
As ideal.
Very cool.
Okay, cool.
Hey, I've got a quick question on Wraith, especially the development of the ferrymen, because those guys always really struck me since they have that Reaper visage, but they're almost one of the more benevolent forces in the Shadowlands. So where exactly did that whole idea come from?
Well, basically, once you start dealing with the concept of death, you have to sort of approach the traditional figures of death in myth and legend, and so we had to come up with a reason why, we had to address that figure mythically, and instead of there being one ferryman, we decided that the Charon was just the first one. And ultimately, I think that harkens back to really Mark saying, I want them to be badass. I want them to be awesome.
All right.
And, I mean, sometimes that's how it is. Sometimes we get this image in our heads and we want this thing to be this way. And so I really do think that the ferryman being a figure on a motorcycle or a figure, I think there is a ferryman on a motorcycle in one of the stories with a skid or however you want to say it on his back and
Nice.
driving down the road.
Yeah, excellent.
And of course the Mask of Charon, that thing that's on the cover of Wraith, second edition, and the first edition, the material artwork. It's a thing that Henry Higginbotham did. Awesome artist, incredible artist. He did a lot of stuff for us over the course of time. But he takes found items and found like pieces and parts and puts them all together and makes these beautiful pieces of art.
Oh, wow.
The three-dimensional art. And so that's all those chains and all those. That was the Mask of Charon. That was the
first edition one glows in the dark too.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yep,
it does.
Yep.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Cool.
I had another question actually leading off from that, because you mentioned Charon, and this question comes from Vergast. Was Charon's return always planned, or is that just a story seed that you put into Wraith First Edition, and then Richard Dansky decided to run with it?
Exactly that. Exactly that.
All right.
Story seeds that were planted, because even then we were still leaving subjective story seeds in the game to make it so that you could, if you wanted to, as a storyteller, decide, to hint at Charon's return, or to have someone show up and say they're Charon. That kind of thing. It's a story aspect that's put there for you to use.
Cool. Excellent. Okay, Mage the Ascension, which as regular listeners know, I can't shut up about. I noticed that you worked on the Book of Shadows on the Sertamon or Kertamon. I've never known how to pronounce that.
Yeah, Kertamon, yes. Mm-hmm.
Kertamon. Now, we still use that in our game today,
Awesome.
the system that you come up with for that. Was this something that saw much playtesting? Did this come out of your own games, or was it because we find it works really well at the tabletop, or was it just a little kind of nugget that you dropped in there, to fill up 5 pages, or how did that come about?
No, actually, it was. See, it was very important to me that Mage never leave too far behind its Ars Magica roots.
Exactly.
And so I wanted to make sure that, there was in Ars Magica, it was a big deal. Kertamon was like the thing that made the Order of Hermes work. because before that there were just wizards blasting each other whenever they got pissed off. So
Yeah.
Kirtaman was something that was enabled wizards to have a conflict without actually killing each other, which meant there were a lot more wizards around. And so I didn't want that to be completely lost. I think I do say something in the beginning of that write-up about the fact that, different traditions have different forms of dueling and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But this was something that the Order of Hermes put forward that everyone sort of adopted over the course of time. And I did playtest it quite consistently at the table because I wanted it to be something that I knew that Phil would be looking at it and that Bill Bridges would be looking at it, and I wanted to make sure it would work before I even showed it to them.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it's one of the things that has stood the test of time in the Mage the Awakening, the reimagined version of the game. It's still in there. I don't think it's called Kirtaman. It's called Dual Arcane now, I think. But that's
okay.
Yeah, the concept has remained part of the game ever since. That's very cool. Also, the Council of the Nine. I saw that you'd done the initial groundwork on them. And they, of course, became a massive part of the Mage meta plot as the game progressed throughout its life. Was it your intention to see them, become so interwoven with Mage canon, or did you imagine them more as nebulous background figures?
Well, once again, that was I think a lot of that was part of the flavor text and a lot of the explanatory text over the course of time. So yeah, those things were just thrown out there, and I feel very fortunate that people later on chose to take them and go with them instead of just ignoring them and going by them. So I'm glad that they did. Part of the way that White Wolf worked back then especially, was that everything was work for hire. So if I came up with an idea and I signed a contract that was work for hire, that idea was White Wolf's idea. After that, I mean that whole concept. So they were very shrewd about building on the intellectual property they already had in their coffers, as it were. So they did that, and they didn't have to pay another person anything for that. They could have come out with a complete source book about. In fact, they did several times about the stuff that I just sort of tossed off in various parts of the story, and it was taken by extremely good writers and the developer at the time and made into a authentic, awesome, 100% good book.
Cool. The last thing I wanted to mention about Mage is the tarot deck, which probably ranks up there as one of my favorite Mage, I say, supplements or props. It's such a luscious, gorgeous design, and you're usable in game as well. How much of a hand did you have in that? Because I know you were involved in that to one degree or another.
Well, I was a tarot reader in college a lot.
Oh, right, okay.
And I had my own deck, and I did a lot of readings for friends, and I still can do those readings. I actually did some for a Relay for Life cancer benefit a little while ago. But I only do them I when I do them now, I tell people that this is just for amusement, and if it does speak to you, that is because it's something that your brain is picking up on. At any rate, I love the idea of the tarot cards, but I cannot claim any part of that. That is probably all Richard Thomas is doing.
Okay.
And how beautiful it was, and in how he took his catalog of artists and made it happen.
Okay, fantastic. Now, finally, Changeling. Speaking of cards, you mentioned on your website that you couldn't talk Mark out of the cantrip cards.
Yeah,
which I sort of had a love-hate relationship with those things. I was really happily collecting them when they came out, and then I thought, I don't really want to actually have to use these at the table. So yeah.
I really wish we had, but if you look at the second edition, of course, it doesn't exist in second edition. The cards don't of Changeling. But the cards, please no. Oh no. It was totally tacked on, and it was done. It was brought in at the very last part of the process,
right?
And tacked on at the end, and it was due to just this need for cards, this marketing need for cards, and I just
Sort of
couldn't.
post Magic the Gathering sort of.
Yes, exactly. I
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
my cards.
Yep.
Darn it!
Yeah.
Is what Mark said. So yeah, and that's okay because it did. You could completely ignore them as well.
Yeah, exactly.
If you wanted to.
I've got 8 unopened boosters downstairs, so I'm going to wait another 50 years and then retire. I'm going to sell them and retire.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
you've also said that Changeling was your favorite game to design.
It was.
Why was that?
Because, well, first of all, after Wraith, anything could be. It's kind of like going out.
You can only go up from there, really, can't you?
Yeah, banging your head against the wall for a while and then going and sleeping on a feather bed. It's gonna feel really good. It's like I feel about camping when you come home and you take a hot shower. That's the best shower ever. No, really, with Changeling, I enjoyed it because it is a love letter to geeks, nerds, misfits, people like me.
Right.
That's what it is. And there, we couldn't. I don't think we actually came out and said that in so many words because it's not really a heavy marketing push to simultaneously sort of insult people while you're trying to get them to play your game.
Yeah.
But that's what it was. It was purely. It was completely a love letter to the dreamers and the people who never felt like they fit in.
Right.
Interesting. Now, Sam, was Changeling the Dreaming originally designed for the World of Darkness, or was it supposed to be a standalone game? I heard someone mention this at a Vampire: The Eternal Struggle tournament, and I wasn't sure what to make of it.
Well, if you look at the back of Vampire the Masquerade First Edition, it says, coming soon, Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Fairy, and Ghost.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay? So that right there proves that in 91, the Changeling was going to happen. Fairies were a part of Ars Magica from the very first days of the design of the game. In fact, in Ars Magica, there's the church, there's fairies, and there's wizardry. And those are the 3 big powers in the world. But, beside that, it was going to be part of the World of Darkness from the beginning. And in fact, you see the Chiasid bloodline that is fairy-based. You see the fairy aspects of the Fianna. You see the fairy aspects, the fairies involved with the Verbena, or, and so there's going to be fairy in there somewhere. And really, it was originally designed for that purpose, for the World of Darkness. Now, a lot of people think that it doesn't hang together with the other games because Fairy just lively doesn't even, I was talking about that whole subjective-objective thing. Fairies just sort of, they have their own universe and they invite you to it. Yeah. So I can see why somebody might think that it was a standalone game because, we all have our own, here in the Changeling worldview, we all have our thing that's happening and we draw you into it, which was a way to handle the consistency problem. Because we can say, all this other stuff is going on, all this fairy stuff is going on outside of the knowledge of the vampires and outside of the knowledge of the werewolves and outside of the knowledge of the mages, because they can't even see it or interact with it.
Yeah.
It's another layer of reality. And at that point in time, there was a secret cabal of artists, designers, and developers in and amongst White Wolf called the World of Mostly Dimness Cabal. And we wanted to put some hope back into the game. We wanted to inject hope and positivity into the game somehow, into the World of Darkness as a whole, because it was so unrelentingly dark after Wraith that there had to be some balancing, and that's what Changeling did. So if you think of Changeling as the light to Wraith's shadow, then it's a perfect. You get an idea right away of what it's all about and why it does fit in the world of darkness. Having said that, I think fairies are scary as hell. I mean, they're some of the most fiendish, and because they're all at once familiar and mysterious and completely unpredictable.
Yeah.
Yep, and that's
Sure.
definitely covered in the new Changeling: The Lost game. They went for that aspect, and it's very cool for that. Sam, you've been writing and podcasting for a little while now. Could you talk about the series of stories that you've been producing?
The first novel was Heart of the Hunter, and that's available for free as an audiobook at heartofthehunter.com. That's the first draft in audiobook form, so you can listen to it. It's not like you should not expect Hollywood level sound editing, but it is out there for you to listen to and enjoy for free. And then the next book will be Soul of the Sorcerer, which picks up the story shortly after it left off. And it's I'm really enjoying this process of having having a story, writing it, and podcasting it. I'll be beginning podcasting of Soul of the Sorcerer hopefully before the end of the year.
Are they fantasy novels or?
They are. They're
Cool.
set in my own personal world that I've been developing since I was 8.
Outstanding.
And
Very cool.
yeah, so it is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek sort of thing. I think Stephen Brust. I use a lot of real-world, modern-day accents to denote various personality types, and I'm not at all ashamed of doing so. The same kind of thing Robert Asprin does in his Myth Adventures books, and it's not meant to be that level of funny and crazy, but somewhere between Stephen Brust and Robert Asprin, I'm sort of right there.
Oh, that sounds fun. And are you doing any game design work these days, or is novel writing keeping you a slave to the keyboard?
Well, actually, I am doing. I'm actually adapting LARP rules for Second Life, which is a
Second Life.
virtual world platform. I'm going to be testing a new set of LARP technology for Second Life using an upcoming charity event as a springboard. So hopefully, if I can get that working, we can start having virtual LARPs in Second Life for people. Wow, and cool. It'll be a thing where for free you can sign up and you can come in costume, and if you can't get to a LARP in real life, you can get to a LARP in Second Life.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. So, Sam, it's getting kind of late, and I've got one last question for you before we head out. If you could be a household appliance, which would you be and why?
Probably a home media server.
Home media server?
Yeah. I'd be there. I would give everyone, inspiration and entertainment and fun and, be there all the time. Yeah. That's probably, that's the first thing that came to my head.
Cool. I have one question as well. Seeing as Mike just stole my question.
Damn.
That's all right. We ask every guest that one, but he got there first. I also wanted to, the other.
Has anybody else been a home media server?
No, Eddie Webb said he was going to be an iPod, but that's not a home. That's not a home.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
If White Wolf asked you back, with a blank check and a free reign, what dream supplement for any one game would you like to write?
What I would do is I would do the project that me and Josh Tenbrook and Chris McDonough and a bunch of other people really, 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 really wanted to do, which was essentially a fantasy World of Darkness game. Now, I know that a lot of people say, oh, Exalted is that. But no, Exalted is more of an anime, more of a, that sort of anime-ish sort of world. And this was more of a dark, it was more of a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay take on fantasy. We had a proposal we put together, and we said, okay, look, medieval Europe has been invaded by hell.
Oh, cool.
Like Satan has broken the bonds of the seals that keeps him from where he is, and he's put these in the much the way the Romans did. He's put these dark roads everywhere throughout Europe, and there are these legions of hell beasts and demons that are patrolling everything, and everything is tainted with hell. And you play heroes who have elemental light inside of them, and you're bringing hope. That you're actually, like, when you go to a village and you do something with those villagers, they are freed from their taint for a period.
Oh wow, cool.
And the really cool part was, and I have to just say that, the really cool part was that there was this light characteristic that everyone could donate points of light to one person to get them to have an extraordinary success on one particular activity or action. So literally all these people could work together to push one person over the top so that at the dramatically appropriate moment they could do something heroic and sacrifice themselves.
Oh, excellent. So proper heroic fantasy in a world of darkness.
Well, yeah, really, really heroic fantasy, but heroic fantasy with a very dark edge.
Yeah.
And sort of a really hopeful. It's this whole, striving against the darkness kind of thing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'd love that. That'd be a lot of fun.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it really does. Wow. All right, outstanding. Well, Sam, thank you very much for this great interview. I know it ran a little long,
Thank you.
but
Really enjoyable.
I don't think any of the listeners will be complaining about that. So thank you very much, and we appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. No, that was
Okay.
it was a blast from start to finish. Thank you very much for that.
All right, thank you.